JZU members and invited guests out there to our talk this evening on gospel nonviolence in the life and legacy of Daniel Berrigan, S.J., by the Reverend Bill Wylie Kellerman, Methodist minister, author, and longtime peace activist. This is the third installment of discussions in the JZU Nonviolence series, Seasons of Nonviolence. Our fourth and final presentation will occur next Wednesday, February 10th, when Professor Gail Presby from the University of Detroit Mercy and Classe Center will speak on Gandhi's contribution to the development of tactics in nonviolent activism. It should be another outstanding program that you're all invited to attend. My name is John Dubosh, and I'm a member of the JZU Peace and Justice Committee. I'll be your host this evening. And before we get started, there's a few points that I'd like to make. First of all but myself and Bill are now muted to give optimum environment to hear the speaker. We would also suggest that participants turn off your video during the talk so as to give us better connectivity and a smoother transmission of the feed. Both the microphone button and the video button are on the left-hand bottom of your screen. If you are having trouble with the audio, even with the mic on, check the volume on your computer, excuse me. Each program will be recorded and the link will be shared with participants after the series is completed. If you don't want to be recorded, turn off your video camera now. You can make comments this evening by opening the chat option by clicking on the chat button in the middle of the bottom of your screen. To ask a question for the presenter, open chat and click on the drop-down box labeled Everyone and select Marge Sears. Then type your question. Marge will screen and record questions as they come in and will read as many as possible to the speaker during the question and answer time. We will end promptly at 9 o'clock and open up mics at that time. The co-sponsors for this series are the JZU Peace and Justice Committee, the Beloved Community, which is a continuation of last winter when it was halted by the pandemic. The principles and practice of nonviolence are needed even more today, and we are grateful to our presenters and to you participants from taking the time to be here. We hope that you'll be able to take away some practical ideas and actions that you can use in everyday living. We also hope that you'll attend next week for the event on February 17th. At the end of the series, you'll be able to receive an action guide with useful websites and organizations to further inform and challenge you in the practice of nonviolence. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to take a few moments to pray. So the following might be familiar to you. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up to the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, and they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Bill Wylie Kellerman is a community activist, a teacher, writer, and pastor. For 5 decades, he's been engaged in direct action and civil resistance to war and the structures of urban radicalized violence. Born in Detroit and its river watershed, he acknowledges the Anishinaabe peoples on whose land he lives and works. With Jesus, he bets his life on gospel nonviolence, good news to the poor, word made flesh, beloved community, and freedom from the power of death. Daniel Berrigan is among the clearest U.S. voices for gospel nonviolence of the last century. His influence on the church is even now bearing fruit under Francis. This presentation and conversation will explore the theological, spiritual, and biographical roots of Berrigan's commitment and how it was expressed in new forms of liturgical direct action. As many others, Wylie Kellerman brings to this his personal relationship and experience of Dan as mentor and friend. He will draw from the contents of a forthcoming book, Celebrant's Flame, Daniel Berrigan in Memory and Reflection, soon to come out through Cascade Press. So with that introduction, I'd like to turn it over to Bill.
Thank you, John. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, you're good.
Good. Thank you. I'm so grateful to Jesu for doing this series. Honored to be in it with John Thorne and Kim Redigan and Gail Presby. That's a great gift. I think of other talks and studies I've been part of with you all, and as I looked at faces there, it's folks, so many folks that I work side by side with in movement spaces and in the city. So I'm grateful for the community gathered here. By way of preface, John mentioned this book. I just early yesterday morning, actually in the middle of the night, turned in the manuscript for it. I'm going to ask Sue to put up the table of contents so you can see. Yeah, I do that for several reasons. One, there may be things you want to ask about that I'm not going to talk. That's a dangerous offering. But secondly, just so you see, my head is kind of full of and exploding with this stuff. I've been working on the book for the last 3 months or so. And I should say maybe just a little bit about how it came to be. John Deere asked me to write something short for a project that he's doing, something about Dan and his poetry. And to get my juices flowing, I printed out a bunch of stuff that I'd previously written. And when I spread it all out on the desk, I was like, hey, is this the skeleton of a book? Are these pieces of a book? And Cascade Press responded very quickly that it was. So some of this is material that I've written before and altered and edited in a variety of ways. I'm going to ask Sue to put up a photo of me and Dan from probably, I'm going to say 1978 maybe. You can see I've hardly changed a bit. And Dan, I should say, was in and out of Detroit. I think the occasion of this is actually he preached for me at a church I was serving, but he was in town because we did what we were calling then an underground seminary gathering. That was at Messiah, Church of the Messiah on the east side. I know there are some Messiah folks on the line here. And further, he taught at Gales University, the University of Detroit in, I think, 75. And his course was attended by Peter Weber, Tom Lumpkin, Mary West, others who were in the process of talking about a Catholic worker movement. Actually, I think the conversation started in the midst of that class. So Day House, in many ways, is the fruit of Dan's teaching here in Detroit for a semester. Thanks, you can go pull that down, great. Thanks to John Dubosh, both for the introduction, but also for his reading of the Beatitudes. I have several specific memories of Dan talking about the Beatitudes. One, very early on in my connection with him, he came to Union Seminary, where I was a student, when he got out of Danbury Prison in 1972. And I say Union, he came to Woodstock College, the Jesuit school across the street that was connected. We had cross registration. So I was in a class of his on the Book of Revelation and Jacques Ellul. But he also brought in folks who had been prisoners with him at Danbury and took us down to the Worker and the Thomas Merton Center at St. John the Divine. And one of the things we did was go to the trial of the Camden 28. That was one of the later draft board raids. It was actually one that had been infiltrated by the FBI, and so they had, and who provided plans and materials and such to virtually entrap them. And so we went down for a day that Dan was testifying in their trial. And Ned Murphy, a priest in Brooklyn, who was part of that action, was the one who put questions to him, and he asked Dan if they had ever studied the Sermon on the Mount together, and Dan said yes, and he entered a Bible into evidence and asked Dan to read from the Sermon on the Mount. So that was really the beginning of his testimony that in that courtroom. On another occasion, I was on a retreat with Dan, and we did a session on the Beatitudes, and he kind of took me by surprise, just turning to me and asking me to read them, and it may partly have been because of the experience of him on the stand, but I just got kind of overwhelmed and choked up just reading the Beatitudes from Matthew on that occasion. I think of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, including not only blessings, but woes as well. So there are woes to the rich, or you who are filled, or you who laugh now, or who people speak well of. And I should say that structuring of the Beatitudes makes me think of a piece of a poem of his, a letter to the Vietnamese prisoners, and which at one point I memorized. I'll say a little more about that. But there's a stanza which goes, in that day, the ingathering, but first the scattering. In that day, the banquet, but first the starvation. In that day, the freedom, but first the prison. In that day, the healing, but first the torture. In that day, the music, but first the mourning. In that day, the justice, at first the false judgment, in that day the rebirth, at first the bloodletting. That's part of a long poem and little known called A Letter to the Vietnamese. It was published in a series of posters by Wabin Press, which was connected with the Thomas Merton Center at St. John the Divine in the 70s, and Tom Lewis did illustrations. All the posters, there are like 8 posters, and they all fit together. I mean, it's a very long poem. And as I mentioned, I memorized it probably in the summer of 73 or 74 during a tiger cage fast and vigil on the steps of the US Capitol. And to say that, first to say that a tiger cage, some of you may know that immediately and others will be confused by it, is a form of jail cell, prison cell, which was used for political prisoners in South Vietnam. And they were discovered by, what's his name? Don Luce, who was part of the American Friends Service Committee. And they were cells which opened from above. Often they were buried underground. And they were so small that you could not lie fully lengthwise. So people, it was actually a form of torture. And Don Luce was the one that uncovered them. And they organized this, a fast and vigil on the steps of the Capitol. The cages actually were manufactured here in the States and shipped almost like containers to Vietnam. And what AFSC had decided to do, they had a construction of a model of a tiger cage and wanted to have it in front of the Capitol so that tourists coming could be leafleted and talked to, and as well as legislators. And the Capitol Police arranged, no, you have to be, on the other side of the parking lot here on this little grassy spot. But the folks at Jonah House, which was Liz McAllister and Phil's community, they had a more portable one, which they carried and tried to deliver into the Capitol. They took it up to the 2 big double doors and were actually at that point physically prevented from taking the tiger cage in. And so they set it down right beside the front door. And for the whole day, they leafleted people who were coming and going. And then during the night, since they'd already established this space, the AFSC folks brought up their more substantial one made out of plywood and set it up in the same, they did a switch. And then it was there all summer, for the whole summer. People, anyone going into the Capitol in the main doors walked by this tiger cage, and there were groups each week fasting. I'm telling this story much longer than I should have. But part of my week-long fast there, when I would sit in the tiger cage, I memorized Dan's poem, his letter to the Vietnamese, which he'd written in prison. And maybe on Gail, I know is on, she certainly recite it for a homily once at St. Peter's, but I'm just going to do a few parts of it. It begins, "Dear friends, your faces are a constriction of grief in the throat. Your words weigh us like chains. Your tears and blood fall on our faces. Prison, Vietnam, prison, US. Mothers bear us in prison, our tongues taste its gall. Bars spring up from dragon's teeth, a paling, impaling us. A universal, malevolent will, crouched like a demon, blows winter upon us, stiffens our limbs in death, the limbs of women and children. Here, they hawk death in the streets, death in the Hamburg joint, death in the hardware, death in the cobbler's hammer, death in the jeweler's glass, the classy showrooms of death. Death, shouts the newsboy. Death, oranges, lemons, death in a candy wrapper, death. The cinema blares it, death. But out of sight and mind, like an aquarium at midnight, like the eyes of a captive tiger, a colony of golden eyes of bees in their cells, the miser's mine of jewels, throttling the moon underground, you and I. Our why dragged in the dust, a flayed animal's entrail, our how long, long as the lifeline thrown from God to Job. I'm going to do a couple more parts. This is toward the end. He clearly writes at Christmas time, and you can hear that in these lines. If the birth of a child is sufficient reason to trim the lamps of the universe, to grace seasons in wedding garments, to wreathe in smiles our stiff-jointed discontent, then it must be held with equally logic that the murder of a child is sufficient reason to burn like trash or offal those hunting licenses which go by the civilized euphemism of draft files, to endure imprisonment, loss of repute, the mark of Cain burned by the perfumed hands of judges, churchmen, and politicos on the forehead of Abel. And then lastly, to the end of it, he says, A.J. Musty, we need a foreign policy for the children. Exactly thus, foreign domestic policy, item. The nearest child is the farthest. The nearest blood is not thereby most dear. American airmen dropping their liquid fire on faraway hamlets bear in breast pocket Kodak prints of their children. Thus far, the corruption on high and the call in the course of the blood. It is snowing tonight as I vigil, the first white fall of winter, bitterly cold. I think on the fevers and horrors of Kansan. No to their no, yes to all else. Kansan is the prison island where the tiger cages were discovered. And I'm interested in the no and the yes at the end there, particularly in terms of talking about nonviolence. How do you do an action that is both a no, but is also a yes simultaneously? And I think, I guess I've come to the conclusion that the way Daniel and friends did that and shared it was in what I've taken to calling liturgical direct action. I won't say they invented it, certainly has precursors, but they really gave a very particular form to civil disobedience, if you will. And the primary, well, not the first one, but the second was Catonsville, the Catonsville 9 in May of 1968, when Dan and Phil and 7 others entered a draft board, took out the 1A files and burned them with homemade napalm, and then stood around the fire and prayed. There's footage of that which can be seen. It was controversial, even I would say in Catholic worker circles. Thomas Merton had questions about the destruction of property, and Dorothy Day did it first, though eventually in a talk at the liturgical conference, she referred to it as an act of prayer. And William Stringfellow went farther on this point. He noted particularly how Dan and Phil and others in the group, there were other priests and women religious who had been influenced by the Second Vatican Council and the whole movement of the renewal of liturgy, and in effect moving the sacraments to the streets, or at least recognizing sacramental action in public places. And I think it's fair to say that the liturgical element that they brought to these, and there were hundreds of draft board raids in the wake of that, of the Baltimore Four and the Catonsville action, that they were disciplined in a certain sense. Their nonviolence was in effect disciplined by the liturgical form. And at the same time, Dan and Phil in particular, the Catonsville group, were virtually dragging the church into the anti-war movement. The two of them appeared on the cover of Time magazine with their priestly collars. And in a similar way, I would say to which Martin Luther King was attempting to, if not drag, at least bring the anti-war movement and the freedom struggle into alignment together in his speech at Riverside Church Beyond Vietnam. And I would say, I mean, they were, Dan in particular was involved in a civil disobedience as an act of liturgical renewal. I guess that's what I've tried to say here. And that the impact of that is actually, I think, in the present moment, bearing fruit. And particularly, I'm thinking in the Roman Church, where under Francis, the just war theology is being upended and questioned, and really gospel nonviolence is being embraced. And of course, there are many streams that feed that, but you really have to, one of those has to pass through Catonsville, and also the Plowshares actions in the 80s, which again, Dan and Phil kind of pioneered. They did the first one using hammers, acting out the second chapter of Isaiah and the beating of swords into plowshares, actually using hammers on weapons, nuclear weapons, and other armaments. And again, this is a liturgical form that they've brought, raises the same questions of violence to property, but I think under the rubric, they would say of, you know, some property has no right to exist. One of the things I'd like to trace, I'm watching the time a little bit, is to say something about the impact of the freedom struggle on Dan and Phil. And it really does need to be, to speak about both of them here. Dan certainly was the one who nudged Philip into the priesthood. That can be said clearly, but it was Phil who he really pushed and pulled Dan into Catonsville and the Plowshares action. But way before that, it was he who uh, really pulled Dan into connection with the freedom struggle. When Phil became a priest, it was as a member of the Society of Saint Joseph, and he chose them because they were working specifically in the African American community, and in his basic training for World War II in the South, he had witnessed the way that people were treated, and that really shaped how and where he wanted to serve as a priest. And I should say I'm drawing some of this material that I'm sharing from a dissertation by Eric Martin, who did a dissertation on Dan's conversion, actually a series of conversions, as a dissertation at Fordham University. And so I've had some opportunity to look at that and read it in the last few months. And so that's partly I would want to tip my hat to Eric here in tracking some of this material. He was also the editor of one of the editors of a book, which is the letters between Dan and Phil, called the Berrigan Letters. And I think his work on that overlapped with the work on the dissertation. So anyway, by 1957, Phil, working as a priest in New Orleans, held memberships in the Fellowship of Reconciliation, the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Urban League, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. SNCC. I think I left out CORE. I think he was in CORE as well. Dan was teaching at Lemoyne College, and Phil was a priest in a Black neighborhood in New Orleans. I'm not sure which parish. But at Phil's urging, they set up a kind of tag team operation where Dan was sending students from Lemoyne College down to New Orleans to work with Phil in the neighborhood, and Phil would send young Black students north to Lemoyne to get scholarships and study with Dan. So they had this traffic going, what they called an interracial apostolate. And shortly, early 60s, the Freedom Rides happened. And Dan and Phil signed up for the Freedom Rides. They both asked permission of their orders. Dan was denied permission by the Jesuits. He was certainly ready for civil disobedience and facing what the Freedom Riders had faced, which was really severe violence. But Phil was granted permission and went to New York, made the arrangements with CORE, and flew down. I forget where he was going to meet up with them, in Alabama, I think, or Mississippi. But something happened. For CORE, this was a big deal. They had a number of Protestant pastors who were part of the Freedom Rides, but these were the first Catholic priests who were actually, they would have been the first Catholic priests, Dan eventually was, to be arrested for civil disobedience in the United States. And they let the word out, and Phil was met at the airport in a transfer flight by a whole bunch of press. And the story got out, and the bishop in New Orleans blocked said, the Josephites would be kicked out of his diocese if Phil came and did the freedom rides. So he was turned away. And I think that event also affected a growing frustration with Catholic hierarchy, and that's reflected. You could see that in the Berrigan letters. Dan created something called International House at Lemoyne, which was in the neighborhood, and he moved in with a group of students in a poor neighborhood, and they started. It was a preparation for the students who were going to be doing international study and travel. And one of the tasks that Dan suggested they undertake together was to do research on the absentee landlords in the neighborhood who owned the properties. And it turned out that the number of the slum landlords were actually big donors to Lemoyne College. So this did not fly well when they started making this stuff public. And in a taste of what would eventually be an exile for him, a subsequent exile, his sabbatical was quickly moved up, and he did a trip to Europe and also to South Africa. And I think that's his time in South Africa was important. He was actually invited by the Grail, if you know that community, Catholic feminist community, of which Shirley Beaupre was a member. And she did work in South Africa. I think she was part of the invitation to Dan. Once after a sermon at St. Peter's, she came up to me. I must have mentioned Dan. She said, "You know, we invited him to South Africa," and she told a story which I should remember, but and tried to in the last 3 months, but I don't. But that time, especially he was in the townships. He preached on Good Friday in Johannesburg, and does a really vivid description of that worship service. Not so much what he said, but just the way that the people moved and breathed and chanted, and the veneration of the cross in a way that kind of was part of his own transformation. Anyway, I'll try not to get bogged down. Both of them were part of the March on Washington. They did that arm in arm and heard those speeches, Martin King and on the Mall there. And then I want to mention what will seem like a funny connection in this kind of stream of thought, but in November of '64 was the famous retreat that Thomas Merton convened at Gethsemane, where for several days an ecumenical group, which doesn't sound so radical or controversial, certainly not these days, but at the time there was something to that. And Merton led a retreat on the spiritual roots of protest. And in many ways, that retreat is really what's under, there's really a direct line from that to Catonsville, to the Baltimore 4 action, that gathering, those conversations. And Merton's question that he put before the group was, by what right do we protest? There was one question for those groups. I didn't mention who else. John Howard Yoder was there. A.J. Musty was there. Jim Forrest, Dan's biographer and who was editor at the Catholic Worker, Tom Cornell. So it was all white men. But there's a book by Gordon Oyer, a whole book on that retreat. What's striking to me, and the reason I mention it in this connection, is that among the invitees who were wanted to come were Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin. Rustin, I hope you know his name, Bayard Rustin. He was part of the first organizer of the first Freedom Ride. He was one of King's advisors, almost teachers in nonviolence in the Montgomery bus boycott. He was the organizer of the main organizer of the March on Washington. He was an out gay Black man who suffered a lot on that score. But anyway, the two of them were invited, and even right at the last minute, Merton was still hoping that Bayard Rustin would appear for the retreat. But as it turned out, he went at the same time with Dr. King to Oslo, Norway, where King was receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. And a lot could be said about the importance of the Peace Prize for King, but I've just been totally struck trying to think what a different retreat, albeit already so important, that would have been if those two had been participants. On the question of by what right do we protest, they would have had completely different answers to that question, much more rooted in an ontological experience of being Black in America. And although, yeah, I mean, there's King trying to bring the anti-war movement and the freedom struggle together in his speech at Riverside. I just wonder how things might have been different or deeper, even deeper, if those kind of friendships had been forged in the spiritual community of that retreat. A few months after the retreat, Dan and Phil went down to Selma after Bloody Sunday at the invitation of King. And Dan founded, with Abraham Heschel and Richard Newhouse, an anti-war group called Clergy and Laity Concerned About Vietnam. And Dr. King came to the big invitation meeting to that in New York. He was one of the few Black preachers who came to that organizational gathering. And of course, the speech at Riverside was a Calc event. And he was assassinated exactly a year to the day, April 4, 1968, a year after he gave that speech. And a month after his assassination was the Catonsville action. So I've been learning and feeling this intimate interweaving of lives and movements and experience and training in nonviolence. Two other things that I might mention in connection with Dan's approach to nonviolence. or an expression of it. Um, in February of 1968, which is to say 4 or 5 months, 4 months before the Catonsville action, he and Howard Zinn went to Hanoi at the invitation of the North in order to receive captured POWs, American airmen who were prisoners of war, and which Hanoi would release to Dan and Howard Zinn. And there, so on the one hand, there's a kind of citizens approach to foreign policy, sort of going at a base level, going around government impasses and bringing prisoners back. And then on the other hand, what happened, of course, when they were in the North and in Hanoi, they were beneath the bombing, the U.S. bombing, and in a certain sense, crouching in the shelters was an act of, it's going into a war zone, and in some ways presaged a number of projects, Christian peacemaker teams, or which in a sense it was a seed of, where people go to war zones like Witness for Peace, and share, at least taste, the solidarity of people in their risk and suffering. And so Dan was in the bomb shelters and wrote he's holding a child in his arms in the bomb shelter, and wrote a poem about that, which he read at the trial of the Catonsville Nine. A couple of years earlier, there had been, starting in Vietnam, out of the Vietnamese Buddhist community, Thich Nhat Hanh's order, the Tien Hip order, there were monks and nuns who, as an act of I guess you could say an act of protest, but that doesn't quite do it. But people were immolating themselves to expose and exemplify and call attention to the burning of people by napalm and by the bombings. Nha Chi Mai was one of those. You probably do not know, that there was an immolation, self-immolation here in Detroit on Woodward Avenue, Jefferson, at the foot of Woodward, by a woman named Alice Hertz. I just mentioned that for the Detroit connection. But the immolations came very close to Dan. He was invited to visit a young guy in Syracuse who had burned himself, and he suffered for several days in the hospital. And Dan went to his bedside, and when he speaks of his reasons for going to Catonsville and burning draft files, in his testimony at that trial, he speaks about being at bedside with this young guy. And then subsequently, a young Catholic worker, Roger Laporte, also burned himself. And in that case, In that instance, Dan got into trouble because he refused to call it a suicide. He did not see it as an act of despair, but of self-sacrifice, and that was unacceptable to the cardinal and his order in New York, and that was when he really was exiled out of the country to Latin America, which was like being thrown from the frying pan into the fire. He learned and was another round of transformation for him. But I'm particularly thinking, I raise those because I'm particularly thinking of being at bedside and what we would think of as pastoral acts or even sacramental ministrations at bedside, being acts of nonviolence, which are directly connected to our one of two hands, which are nonviolent action. You may know that Dan was an orderly at St. Rose's Hospital with cancer, a hospice where cancer victims were dying, and he wrote about the folks that he met and was at bedside with in a book called We Die Before We Live. And he did the same thing with AIDS victims. He was led to St. Rose's by a young Catholic worker who was an orderly there, and to the AIDS work by another Jesuit, Bill McNichols. But these are, it's like the Catholic worker thinking in terms of works of mercy and direct action going hand in hand, and that's making a connection, which is fundamental to a spiritually rooted nonviolence. Let's see. I'm going to look at the clock, and I want to share something about one of the ways that I feel like I was mentored by Dan, was in discernment. And I would say that a lot of what I know about vocational discernment, I learned in discerning actions of nonviolent direct action. And I'll tell a particular instance. In the early 80s, the first plowshares action that Dan and Phil and others undertook was in 1980, September of 1980. And in the year or two following that, there were a group of us who had been engaged in direct action in various forms, and who really were prepared to ask together, do we want to undertake similar action? And we met in a series of retreats over the course of a year. It included folks that would be known to you here: Tom Lumpkin, Mary West, Gordon Judd, and myself were the Detroiters. But Larry Rosebaugh, I don't know if you know his name, Oblate of St. Francis was part of the group. There were 7 of us. And we did these retreats where we moved around, actually around the Midwest, near sites that were possible locations for the action. So in that's Southern Illinois, Mid-Illinois, Upper Michigan, Wisconsin. And those retreats, we located them with 2 things in mind. One, to see if this is the place a military base or a production facility where we felt drawn to act. You know, did we feel it by being in proximity? But also to kind of scope out the reconnoiter the landscape for, you know, possible action. And at the time, the cruise missile was being placed forward based in England on ground launch of cruise missiles, and the women there were engaging in a powerful occupation of the Greenham Common military base, surrounding it and cutting the fence and just sort of living through a long, enduring encampment. And the cruise at the time was getting loaded onto B-52s at Wurtsmith Air Force Base. So in a sense, what was happening historically in that moment sort of drew us to Wurtsmith. One of the things that we did, both in building community, but also in moving toward a discernment of the action, was to share our fears. And I think I learned this directly from Dan, that fears, sometimes the very thing that you're afraid of, if you confess your fears, sometimes the very thing you're afraid of is the thing you're being called to do. And if you keep your fears inside, they end up in the service of the powers that be, and they hold you back and constrain you. And if you confess them to your brothers and sisters in community, they might turn out to be a leading, and they can actually be in the service of the Holy Spirit. So that was part of our retreat work and our life sharing. The other thing that we did was Bible study. And of course, we looked at Isaiah 2 and spent time with the nations turning swords into plowshares. But as the liturgical year was turning, we began to spend time with the resurrection passages. And in particular, I remember one day looking at the text in Matthew where the religious authorities are concerned after Jesus had been crucified that the disciples will come and steal him away and claim that he was resurrected. So Pilate sets a guard and seals the tomb. And and that seal that's not just puttying up the cracks to keep the stink in. That's an official seal that would be made with cords and clay, so that to move the stone and break the seal is against the law. And so that was, in our Bible study, suddenly this notion of resurrection being against the law came into play. And I remember a really vivid moment when Tom Lumpkin said, you know what I'd like to do is do the Easter Vigil liturgy walking on to the base. And I remember practically an audible thump in my chest, and I swear I could hear it all around the circle, and we knew that's what we wanted to do. And we made a plan to do that, to do the Easter Vigil, and to walk down the runway, which we eventually succeeded in doing, all the way to the high security area where the B-52s were loaded with crews and other warheads. And so now, in our discernment, a question arose. Is this the place where we want to start swinging hammers in the deadly force authorized area? And there were some of us who said yes. I was one who was raising the question otherwise. And I should say, in the midst of that, Philip and Dean Hammer, another member of the Plowshares Aid, came out and did Bible study with us. We looked again at Isaiah 2 and spent a day with them. But I had written a letter to Dan. I waffled back and forth about writing him, but I did. And he wrote me back. And I think the letter, I'm just going to read it if that's okay. I think it has a good bit about his approach to nonviolence. Dear Bill, I'm glad your almost not letter made it here. And let it be said at start, there's no almost from this end. I'm glad to get this, glad to have heard from you, glad you went to Gethsemane. I did a retreat at Gethsemane. In fact, glad all over. I don't know about all this. On the one hand, I wasn't part of a long trail of obscurity to let's go. That's a limitation, which is almost a predicament. On the other, I know you, Dean, and Phil about as well as I know anyone in this whale of tears, as Mrs. Gummidge puts it mournfully. Therefore, what follows? I know our exchange will be betwixt us too. In any case, I guess it could be said, Phil peddles hardware, I peddle software. There's also some difference discernible in the power of symbols versus literal damages. I agree with all my heart that the best thing we can do in such places as you describe is to celebrate Eucharist, as long as there is accompanying CD of some sort. This latter as to tactics is relatively indifferent to me. It's enough to say, I prayed where prayer was forbidden because death is in charge. On the West Coast, there's some discomfiture on the score of Eastern insistence on symbols and damage. I like, I guess, to call it one thing, symbolic damage. But one ought to keep the two in balance, some damage through symbols. I think the Eucharist supplies the balance. The broken bread says, we break death's stranglehold, ultimately being willing to be broken by being where we are, doing what we do. And so the wine, about life being precious, certainly, but here freely given, not wasted. Whatever follows on this, I consider secondary, in the sense that the main act has been done. Even while I think some thoughtful follow-through is also required to bring Eucharist to bear, so to speak. I might as well say it. Hammers appear to me in such circumstances as you describe, just too flat-footed, literal, a kind of alternate weapon to the nukes themselves, and therefore exciting the worst in the death urges of those guarding. hammers lose the balance for me. I don't think you're in there to dare them to use guns on you because you've used hammers on their deers. In King of Prussia, there was no such dare. It was all freakish, free, and easy. I don't know if this helps. It helps me to try to peck it out, however clumsily. I know, as always, your own reflection will be of immense help to us all. So will the action, because it proceeds from, quote, the deep hardcore Yates. Happy Easter, Daniel. We're back to Eucharist here and to, I guess what I want to call either a sacramental ethic, which I think is a pretty good synonym for nonviolence, where action which recognizes the sanctity of life and the sacredness of the ordinary is brought to bear in a public context and action. And I would also think, and just thinking in terms of our action there, that it could also be called, and Dan does in various places, calls it a resurrection ethic, an ethic of the resurrection, which literally on the face of it means that the power of death no longer rules or holds us, right? Living in that freedom, it's no small, I don't mean to trivialize or minimize it, but that's no small thing to live in, find ways, an infinite number of ways to live in freedom from the power of death. One of the things I haven't done in these last few months, and I think it's worth mentioning here, is to ask, what would Daniel do in our present moment, you know, with the continued rise of nuclear weapons and the international community banning them in the recent treaty, or with the rise of public racism and violence in such terrible forms, with the climate catastrophe and the collapse of the ecosystem beginning, you know, so to say, what would Daniel do is tempting. But one, I think it reduces him to like a moral cipher or a set of principles instead of a living ancestor in whose writings and word and witness we can immerse ourselves and be formed and transformed by, but not reduced to something like a answering machine. And in doing so, let ourselves off the hook, because the real question is, what are we going to do, right? I meant to mention earlier, and I'll come to it now, and I meant to mention it in relation to his practice of bedside presence with people. Jerry Berrigan, in reflecting on his uncle Dan, said that Daniel had a practice. He said that when he walked down the street, he treated people's faces like beads, like the beads of a rosary, which means that each person was the occasion for a prayer to arise from him. And I guess we can do that. We can do what Daniel did in that sense of doing some of his practices without turning him into some sort of dead principle. Well, I'm going to end, but I'm going to end by asking Sue to put up a poster, which is this is actually a poster that's going to be the cover of my book. Just quick, it was made by a young woman in Portland. Her name is Dylan McConus, and she's an artist and a graphic novelist, if you even know what that means. And she painted this on the occasion of Dan's death, after his death, for her father, whose name is Charlie McConus. And Charlie was actually, he was in our classes with Dan, and he was actually a Woodstock student, but in our classes with Dan in 1972 and 73. So the poster has a personal connection. The poem that he's holding it's a portion of a poem called Tulips in the Prison Yard. And the personal connection there is that when we had a house of hospitality in Battle Creek in the late 70s, a group of us, and Dan visited, he wrote Tulips in the Prison Yard, or a portion of it, on our dining room wall, which he was a practice that he occasionally did in Catholic worker and resistance houses. Anyway, while the poster is up, I'm going to read a poem which I wrote for Dan on the occasion of his birthday, I think his 90th birthday, and his 100th birthday will be this May. Cascade Press says they're going to get this book out by his 100th birthday. I don't know if that's true, but I'll be delighted if they can pull it off. This poem is called Giving Voice. The heart dares the word, dares the page, lest love stick in the throat of this pen and go untold. I remember my name in your voice, echoing down the underground hall beneath Niebuhr Place. Come, crack a jar of scotch. Come for talk and a minute brew of tea. Come to life, awake, arise, and a scent follows, sweet and rash. Somehow that calling pipes through the Kentucky Hills retreat. While I still practice sport, before smoke rose from Detroit, your prayer with Merton and the circle breached the walls to fall also on me, summoning unbeknownst an answer. Later, in a session of crushing dark, you opened for me the gatehouse door, there to walk and breathe and eat the saltery, to face dread dreams and heal. Confess a thing, even on this island now, the table talk of poet and keeper hatches the seminary renegade. That heady, charismatic irony revives as we speak, and our once fresh formation turns. Can it be toward eldering? As toward the body politic, body of word presented, burning with truth, the charnel house lies. This blood on pillars, a gash of vermilion, or hammering wood at the door of church and state. In consequence, this bravery with a difference, the Holy Ghost gone militant, free in the cuff, in the dock, in the yard, for all, for missives kited in and out, for the discipline of hope, for drinking the moon underground, for writing on the wall against it, for bread in lotus fingers, all echoes in the heart at dusk, footfalls on the way beloved, this thanks untellable. Amen. I think there's time for questions.
And before we do, Bill, on behalf of all of us, I want to thank you for sharing your personal and hope-filled reflections about Dan and Friends. That was a marvelous presentation.
Thanks.
I just want to mention too that next Wednesday will be our final talk, February 10th. Remember that Gail Presby from the University of Detroit Mercy will be speaking on Gandhi's contribution to the development of tactics in nonviolent activism. And if it's anything like Bill's presentation, it'll be worth coming back for. So please come next week. And now we're going to open up for questions. Remember, if you have a question, please look at the drop-down box under chat and send your questions to Marge Sears, who will read them.
Okay, we have a couple of questions already. The first one is, what do you see as necessary to promote a spirituality of nonviolence today?
Great question. Yeah, thank you for that. I think I've tried to get at that some with the notion of liturgical action, which I think goes, well, I think it stems from the kind of spirituality that I think is reflected in what I just talked about in terms of seeing faces on the street and in community as the beads of a rosary. I think the spirituality of nonviolence involves the capacity to recognize the other and the sanctity of the other's life, the sacredness of it, and to be able to intercede. I guess I would mention Bonhoeffer in this connection, in his little book, Life Together, which is about life in community. And I think for Bonhoeffer represented what the spiritual roots of nonviolence in Germany in the 30s required. And one of the things in his description of life together and praying for one another, he said that in intercession, you feel another member of the community or another person's need so deeply that you pray their prayer. You pray for them. You pray in their stead, on behalf of. And the spirituality of nonviolence, I think, involves that intercessory character, which involves imagining and inhabiting the heart and life of other people. I also, I don't know how to nourish the ethics of the resurrection, but I think that's connected. Stringfellow, William Stringfellow, who was Dan's friend and was another of my mentors. And he visited, Dan was arrested at Stringfellow's house after his 4 months underground in 1970. And Stringfellow and his partner Anthony Town visited Dan and Phil at Danbury. And they were struck by how not free the warden and the chaplain and those who were facilitating the visit, people at the authorities they had to go through, who were completely anxious and having to defer to higher authority. Stringfellow felt like they were in bondage. And on the other hand, that in prison, Dan and Phil, while they might be discomfited or inconvenienced, were actually completely and fully free in prison. And I think one of the clues there, which relates to spirituality and nurturing a spirituality of nonviolence, is that you can do it anywhere. You can be where you are and nourish that. You can do it in prison. You can in a corporation. You can be at the soup kitchen. In a sacramental and resurrection ethic, any place is a place where the spirituality of nonviolence can be enacted.
Well, we have quite a few questions now. So here's one related to William Stringfellow. Did the Berrigans see their work through the biblical lens of powers and principalities? And did they have a framework for direct action?
Say that one more time.
Did the Berrigans see their work through the biblical lens of powers and principalities? And did they have a framework for direct action?
Yes, I would certainly say so. And that has part of that framework has to do with the friendship, which really was a theological conversation between Dan and Phil and Liz and William Stringfellow. At the end of his time in underground, Dan had that period of 4 months where he'd been convicted of the Catonsville action, and they'd been through appeals and lost, and he was supposed to turn himself in. And I think the day that he was supposed to turn himself in, they held a big festival of hope at Cornell University where he was chaplain. And the room was lined with, I didn't intend to tell this story, but I hope it illustrates. The room was surrounded by federal marshals and FBI folks because they were dubious that he was going to turn himself in. And he spoke, and on stage were a group were puppets of the Bread and Puppet Theater. The 12 apostles were arrayed kind of behind him in these giant puppets that people put on puppets. And he was asked if he wanted to get out of there, and he said yes. And the lights went out, and somebody grabbed him and switched places with him. And suddenly the lights came on, and he was inside one of the puppets, and he had disappeared. And the puppets made a procession out of the auditorium, and the marshals, and it's like a magic trick almost. And that began a 4-month-long underground journey where he would appear in church pulpits, even on national television, and preach. He was on the 10 most wanted list and driving J. Edgar Hoover crazy. And that came to an end at, he went to Block Island, which is at that time, which is where William Stringfellow and Anthony Town lived. And actually, because Liz and Phil were writing love letters to one another that they thought they had a clear channel. Phil was at that point in Lewisburg prison, and Liz made a reference in one of her letters to Stringfellow, and that's how the FBI caught up with him at Stringfellow's house. But for those days that they were there together, their conversations at Bill's table, which was in front of a big picture window and overlooked the New Harbor, was on a high point of the island. Their conversations were about several things. One was about the Book of Revelation, and in particular what Stringfellow calls the Babylon parables, the beast that rises out of the sea. There are three beasts that mock and imitate the Trinity in a way, and those stories are really a mythic, poetic description of the principalities. And their conversations were around that. When Dan was captured and went to prison, he continued to study the Book of Revelation with prisoners in there. And Bill wrote a book called An Ethic for Christians and Other Aliens in a Strange Land, which is really a seminal theological work on the powers, and was studied in jails, was kind of Philip called it a handbook for nonviolent resistance. And so I think the conversation between Dan and Bill around the powers was partly where Dan developed his framework. There was certainly some of that at the Merton retreat. John Howard Yoder was there, and he's another person who had done theological, exegetical, biblical work on the powers. And in that case, in the case of the Merton retreat, they were specifically talking about technology as a principality. And that turned into one of the chapters in Dan's book. They call us dead men, which Stringfellow wrote the introduction to. So I don't know if I'm making some connections here, but yes, I think both Dan and Phil had a framework of the principalities, and in which liturgical direct action is a method of confronting and exposing the powers.
Okay, the next one kind of ties in too about powers and principalities. With the exception of a few like Pope Francis, how has the institutional church today contributed to both a general apathy among Catholics to social issues, as well as the rise of white supremacy and religious nationalism? And what needs to change, and will Pope Francis have much influence?
And will Pope Francis have much influence?
Yes.
Yeah, it seems like that's a conversation for this group to be having, and I'm sure it's a live topic among you. I think I think it's fair to say, in trying to trace that freedom struggle history that Dan and Phil went through together, there was an increasing frustration and disillusionment with church hierarchy. I mean, you saw, just hearing the way Phil's participation in the freedom rides was truncated. And after that, Dan wrote a letter to Merton, which has this really fine description of, you know, what we really need is communities, communities of contemplation, spiritual communities that can not be bound by the hierarchical structures, but can move and act with a kind of freedom. And at that point, you know, Dan was he was saying, I'm beginning to think about, he didn't say chucking the whole thing, because he really wanted to hold on to his priesthood, if not the order, the Jesuits. But that's kind of what he was talking about. And Merton said, I understand what you're talking about, and I've had the same thoughts. And Phil wrote to Dan in response, Merton's letter was marvelous. It's really an encouragement. And he said, Phil wrote to Dan, this is in the letters book, where can you and I do the most good right now? I think it's still in the church, right? And I think that they sat uneasy there in many ways. And of course, Phil and Liz were excommunicated when they married. And that Dan as well had come to the point where he was willing to consider not just civil disobedience, but ecclesial disobedience. And preaching the sermon that I mentioned at the Catholic Worker about Roger Laporte, the Cardinal had been clear that no priests were to comment, to speak about Roger Laporte's self-immolation, and the way that Dan did is what got him exiled. So it was in fact an act of ecclesial disobedience. How that translates to the present moment, I think we are in a different moment. I find myself appreciative of Francis on both the environmental front with Laudato Si, but also, I mean, he's convening friends of ours in an international conversation about gospel nonviolence, and I think we're going to see a papal letter, a substantial letter about gospel nonviolence. So anyway, I know you all have studied Laudato Si, and anyway, I commend the conversation. I commend the question you're asking, further discussion.
Okay, the next question is, what can we learn from Daniel Berrigan about what works and what doesn't work in using nonviolence to seek change?
What works and what doesn't work. There's a famous and ongoing conversation. You you could say in the Catholic worker community, but it's much broader than that, about, as though there's an either or, between faithfulness and effectiveness, right?
Mhm.
Are we called to be faithful, or are we called to be calculating and strategic, realpolitik savvy in how we think about action? And I would say, I want to say Dan comes down, insofar as that's a two-footed walking question. He tends to come down on the foot of, maybe more strongly on the side of faithfulness. And I know I think Gail's still on, and I'm sure she may talk about this next week, but Gandhi had an understanding of nonviolence. The Satyagrahi were to, the truth warriors were to, part of their discipline and practice was to let go of results, let go of attachment to results. And that turns out to be a way into the most effective forms of nonviolence. So that a nonviolent army, which in Gandhi's case, essentially kicked the empire out of India in a very effective way, was predicated and founded on not being attached to effectiveness. Okay.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if I'm getting at the question here.
Well, the person said to add that he wanted to use nonviolence to fight racism, white supremacy, voter suppression, and anti-democratic authoritarianism. I don't know if that makes any difference. Those are broad categories.
Yeah. I've been, it was really good for me to discover that thread in Eric Martin's work about the freedom struggle and its transformative impact on both Dan and Phil, partly because I found myself, reading and, in terms of my own memory, I look at the bibliography that I've got for this book, and it's a lot of white men. Yeah, and much that I write about is within that in that circle. At the same time, I do think his life and witness has resources to heavily bear in the present struggle with armed white supremacy in the streets. Even the assault on the Capitol on the 6th. I didn't say this explicitly, but I certainly had it in mind that that bringing the tiger cage, attempting to bring the tiger cage into the Capitol, and even onto the floor of the House of Representatives, was in effect a nonviolent assault on the Capitol. And I think that has something to say about how we reflect on the actions of the right the extreme right, racist right, incredibly delusional right in this in the present moment, that that action at the Capitol, comparing those two actions at the Capitol is worth doing. Thinking about method, thinking about practice, thinking about spirituality, even thinking about effectiveness, I think is worth setting those two things side by side.
That kind of leads to the last question, which it says, our most difficult question is, what do we need to do? Do you think there are some Berrigan rules for how and when to act?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I was cautioning some against that in my own process of deciding not to write into the book what would Dan do now, but I think his consistent willingness to listen deeply and to move with the spirit, and to overcome his own fears, and to draw on resources of courage, community resources of courage in action, and to build communities. I mean, in some ways, if I were to say, what's a lesson to take from Dan's life and legacy, one is that he was constantly building, you could even say, serial communities of prayer and action. The action communities, they would come together around a particular action. It was very intense. And in most cases, it didn't become permanent and institutionalized. On the other hand, you had Jonah House in Baltimore, which through that whole period, was a very solid community, generating campaigns at the Pentagon, or pioneering varieties of nonviolent direct action, and even, I was going to say, new forms of community, but in a way, Jonah House expanded the understanding of what family is and can be. I mean, everybody at Jonah House was raising children and painting houses to make money and doing dishes and leading prayer, and all of the aspects of life together were being shared. On the other hand, it was really Liz and Phil's marriage and their family, which were the constant and the anchor of Jonah House over a period of 30 or 40 years, right? So that was a community that endured and endures. And anyway, I think building community together is a primary lesson. Dan's community, on the one hand, was the Jesuits at 98th Street Jesuit community. On the other hand, it was the Kairos group that he met with that included other folks, and they were doing actions together in New York. but to build community, improvise community, and to be praying and listening and prepared to act together in any given moment. Yeah.
Kind of going back to the an earlier question, this is my question. Do you think today's actions are not as effective because there isn't that sense of community, there isn't that time for contemplation, reflection, analysis, seeking out advice and connections with other people? And is that something that maybe church with a small c could provide?
Yes, I do. I would say yes to that. I guess I want to say that you know, what we're seeing in terms of Black Lives Matter and in terms of here in Detroit, Detroit Will Breathe, I think are really amazing, stunning, young movements of young people who are breaking all kinds of ground, sometimes not knowing it's been plowed before, but movements always act that way, I think. But I think we're witnessing a very powerful really movement that it yet remains to see how it's gonna move now that there's been a change of administration and you know, the Biden program of policy is beginning to take shape. But I think it's a moment where, yeah, building communities, complicated as it has been by COVID, is what's called for. Like I said, really be clear about that.
Yeah, I don't know. Do we have what time for one more, John?
Yes.
Okay. This is from Gail Bell. She says this is a parallel with Gandhi, that Jonah House's anchor being Liz, Phil, and their kids, because Gandhi started many ashrams, and in those early ashrams. Hold on, can't get my button to move here. I think I've frozen. Oh, here we go. There were a lot of his family members and relatives there. And they were some of the first to be arrested in civil disobedience actions, including his wife, Gandhi's wife.
Yeah, that's not a question. That's a contribution to the conversation.
Right.
Exactly
right.
Right. Could I mention two things? Let's see if I can do this. I'm going to put in the chat a link to a short film, a half-hour film, which is available online, and it's called Seeking Shelter. It's about Block Island. It's about Dan's underground time. There's footage of the Catonsville action, and sorry, I'm talking trying. I can't chew gum. And also, actually, I interviewed Dan on film talking about his arrest by the FBI there. Did I get it? Yeah, it's in the chat. And there's a new film coming out, probably for his 100th birthday, called The Berrigans, Devout and Dangerous, by the same woman, Sue Hagedorn, who made the Seeking Shelter film. Really, really good. hour and a half documentary, which she set out to do about Dan himself, but ended up expanding it to be about the Berrigans, Liz McAllister and Philip and Dan, and it's really fine. And then the other thing, I don't think I've mentioned Jim Forrest's biography. No one's seeing, oh,
It's not showing up, I guess.
there it is.
Okay.
Somebody hit send. Jim Forrest's biography of Dan, which came out a couple of years ago, called At Play in the Lion's Den, a biography and memoir. And that's really, that's been in my hand, kind of a companion for the last 3 months.
Someone asked if you could say the name of the book written by Phil on the handbook for prison. I don't know what that is.
I mentioned William Stringfellow's book on the powers called An Ethic for Christians and Other Aliens in a Strange Land. And I said it served as Phil called it a handbook for resistance, and yeah, it was read by a lot of action communities and prisoners.
And you have a book out by William Stringfellow. Do you want to mention it?
I have a couple, yes. The one that's most easily available is from Orbis. It's in their series on modern spiritual masters, and it's called William Stringfellow Essential Writings. I also did an earlier book, which is, I was going to say is better, but it's fatter, called A Keeper of the Word.
We'll try to get all of these in the action resource guide that's going to go out after the series is over. And anything else, Bill, that you think we should put in it, just send it along and I'll share it with everyone. I think we'll close the questions for now. John, if you want to take over.
Okay, I just want to again thank you, Bill, for being with us tonight and sharing your thoughts. It was very, very inspiring, and I'm sure it's going to give us a lot of pause to think about in the days and weeks to come. So thanks again.
Yeah, really glad to be here. For most of the time, I was looking at notes. Well, I know people turned off their cameras, but it's really nice to see faces, folks I know and love, and yeah, be in a conversation together.
People can go ahead and turn their cameras on now if they want.
And I also want to thank Susan Ray for all of her technical assistance tonight, and the two sponsoring organizations, the Jesu Peace and Justice Committee and the Beloved Community. I think, Bill, you've agreed to lead us in a closing prayer.
Oh, I forgot that, but I will. Let's pray. Oh God, who bends the moral arc of the universe toward justice, we give thanks for the life and legacy, the witness, the spirit, the person of Daniel Berrigan, for the way in which he himself underwent transformation, spiritual transformation in you and in history, and for the way in which he calls us to do likewise, and for our own transformation to be connected to the change that we want to see and need to see in the world. Teach us the disciplines of gospel nonviolence. May they show forth in our lives and in our community. We pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen.
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 Thank you so much, Bill. Give him a hand.
Thank you all. So good.
We have just 2 minutes, right, Susan, before we're going to cut off. So if there's anyone who'd like to make a comment, you can unmute yourself.
You know, I'd like to make a comment. This is Bernadette. Can you hear
Go
me?
ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I like the analogy that Bill said. I guess it was it Jerry Berrigan, Dan's nephew, about the rosary beads. At the same time, it struck me as I was sitting here thinking, so does it take 10 were the men, our fathers, and the women, the Hail Marys? Does it take 10 Hail Marys to make one man? I mean, it's just, I don't know. I think the underlying issue of a, I don't know, there's an underlying oppression that I think the church needs to address that's bigger than it's bigger than all of us. But anyway, I think it's interesting that using that analogy of the rosary beads. So
Yeah.
just a thought.
Dan has a great chapter on women priests in 10 Commandments for the Long Haul that I would commend.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, it's 9 o'clock, so.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Bill.
Night.